Hey everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus, but you can call me Noctis. Today I'll be honest straight away. I have little to no clue how this drawing ended up where it did, or why I came to take it in that way. And you will kind of see more of that as we go along here. Originally it was going to be a very typical drawing for me, featuring a person and a universe for reasons that I will touch on later. But it still would have been a drawing where I could spend more time talking about the ideas behind it all. Yet the sketch kept looking wrong and eventually the idea shifted slightly, and here we are with a seemingly normal speed paint for this week that kinda goes a little bit weird near the end. There is still the universe aspect, and there is still a person by the end of it, but it wasn't quite where I imagined it to go. But before we begin to unpack all of that, I do want to quickly touch on things from last week. Notably, I didn't upload anything last week, but I am fairly consistent in my schedule, and it is something that I try to keep to for myself as well. So, what happened? I did make a post on the channel briefly explaining it, but it's again kind of relevant here as it did play into this drawing somewhat. See, I started this drawing a few weeks ago, alongside a batch of other sketches that I have then been since working through. It was going well, and starting last week, I did believe that I would have it ready for last week, just as I had been intending to, as I kind of thought I would only have a few things left to do on the image. By that point, I already had the main focal point done, and in my mind, I kind of thought that I was much further along in this drawing in particular. However, on Monday, a few things came up for that day and then later in the week, which, despite my best efforts, kind of meant that the drawing wasn't going to be my main priority or done until later in the week due to timing allowances, and I really didn't want to rush finishing it. I still thought that maybe I would have time. Then, when I got to working on it, I realised that I wasn't really happy with the image like I thought I was. I had the main sketch and the focal point done, yet I didn't like part of the sketch, a part of the process that I will end up touching on later. Yet it was kind of then that I decided to revisit the idea and rework it. Again, more relevant later, but it did mean that there would be no chance I'd have anything ready for last weekend. I kind of gave up on having it out in my usual routine, and instead just decided that it would be easier and better for me to push it to this week instead and actually give it the attention and time that this video would need from me. And then somehow here we are, a week later than I initially planned, but a drawing either way. It also wasn't so bad since last week I could further some other ideas that had been sitting for a while now, and I kind of made a progress here and there too. But enough of that, as I will likely have plenty more opportunities to go into all of those other ideas when their time comes. Let's actually start moving into the video here, as I want to start on the origin of this idea rather than vaguely mentioning later stages. Now, I know that I have also mentioned this particular friend in passing before as well, which was again fairly recent as our conversations have been sparking quite a few ideas lately. She's the same one who inspired me to draw the clock tower in that speed paint, and I think that I will soon need a nickname for her if she keeps giving me these ideas. I also don't want to give away too much about her, but one of her main interests is space and science behind the way that it all works and interacts, which is why we usually end up in conversations surrounding the science side, and just talking about how things would operate and processes that are part of things like the stars and their life cycles or the suns and their planets. Yes, okay, the explanation she gives can sometimes go right over my head, yet she is really good at putting it into simple terms that I can understand as well, which is usually why I enjoy these conversations. I mean, space has often been an inspiration or curiosity of mine, yet it's a far more passive thing as I appreciate the visuals of it. Anyway, this idea actually began because we had been discussing the life cycle of a star. I had been wondering about the different types of stars within this cycle, and also outside of it. We were talking about how they form and grow, and then went into what typically occurs as a star begins to die, and how that can then go a few ways. This conversation, as so many of ours do, went slightly off course, and we ended up talking about the formation of planets, and then quite a natural progression, we began to touch on the topics of galaxies within the universe. Within all of this, we had also been looking at pictures, as she had been showing me some different objects and images that kind of went alongside the explanation of everything. This is where I began wanting to look at space as a source of inspiration once again, as I used to in the past, but it's kind of taken a back seat recently. So from having the actual idea itself, I had to find references and consider what I could do with the visual of a galaxy. I knew that it would be something to have fun with, and I knew that the galaxy would be the focal point of it all. So I actually looked back into my sketchbook for ideas that, in the past, I may have scrapped or moved on from, in favour of something else. There was actually then a couple of months ago where I had a page or two full of space ideas in the sketchbooks or on loose sheets of paper that I never really took much further. And I only never progressed them because I preferred other sources of inspiration at that point. For this one though, it was perfect. There were a host of ideas sitting there waiting for me to find again, that also spurred a few other ideas down this avenue than just the one seen here. All it meant was that I have a few ideas coming up that could potentially be drawing off themes or motifs of space again, and there were many sketches that I couldn't tie into this one for now. This one is one I actually remember sketching though. I noted it down with the idea that maybe to revisit it later with the context of a universe's heart, or some similar motif. There would be a person and the galaxy closer to them, somehow conveying that the two are connected. It was a passing thought that I kind of wanted to be somewhat present in the sketch, but the early phases had also been focused on experimenting more than anything in this particular instance, so I didn't want to get too caught up in any of it. I wanted to have fun, do a galaxy, and maybe revisit these themes later, as there are again plenty of routes that I could have otherwise taken for it. Maybe to some, the theme will still come through in the end. I kind of decided in the later phases that it could be applied here and hold relevance with the changes that I made to it, but I did go through most of the development doubting what it was that I was trying to say or what I was drawing. This drawing kind of started and ended up with the idea that I would see where it would go and not worry too much about the message and story tied into it, as I would just experiment. I would just draw and worry about all of that later. And honestly, it's part of why I enjoyed this piece so much. Now, I will also stress here, in case anyone watching is super into galaxies or space or anything, that I wasn't trying to make a photorealistic galaxy in this drawing, and I was mainly going off what looked good before any sort of real functionality and the forces at play. I was having fun, and it was a focal point and adding details with a reference to the side that I wasn't really trying to copy either. I was just working and having fun. I was just using the colours and the interactions from the image, and I just wanted something to look good to get me into this piece a bit more. It was actually quite interesting because in the end I did hesitate to show it to said friend, just because I know that some part of the galaxy would be slightly off in some way, and the focus was appearance before accuracy, though in the end she did end up enjoying the art as well. But in terms of process and the actual timeline of this drawing, I started with a very simple sketch and kind of dove straight into the deep end from there. I didn't bother too much with the flat colour stages that I normally do, and kind of focusing on them being their own thing. This time, I suppose part of me knew that there would be an issue with it later on, and I wanted the focal point sorted before anything else, since I would want it done, and otherwise, if it wasn't, I'd be more inclined to setting this drawing aside later on, and then it would have never gotten finished. It's why the early phases of this video is the galaxy being done and bits being added to it and worked into it. I also suppose keeping simple flats for that area wouldn't have worked too well either, as it never would have looked quite right until I furthered and focused on the details themselves on it. It's why I had that reference there, and kind of let myself work on the details to it as I have said. From there the break came and the distractions. I won't go into why and what they were, but it kind of took me away from the art for a few days, and with how hectic it became, I also kind of lacked the urge to draw in the evenings when I had the time to. I decided not to push myself and to simply allow myself those days as a break, as I also knew that I wouldn't have the capacity to think about what looked good or not in those days either. Coming back to it, however, I realised that I didn't like the sketch anymore. I kind of realised that I may have never liked that sketch and always intended to change it. I loved the galaxy, and I thought it worked really well, especially with the rest of the idea. I also realised that I wasn't sure of the star halo thing that I planned out either, but that was a detail that the more I looked at it, the more I was willing to work with it for the moment and kind of see where it would go. But I knew that the person had to change. The face didn't look right, and I had to change it as I knew I would otherwise come to scrap the image later down the line, and it wouldn't be shown to anyone. So I did, and I changed the face and I changed the person. I felt that maybe it would look good the further I took it. The galaxy didn't look right at the start, but it worked out in the end, which is where I borrowed my attitude from, just to kind of maybe give it a go and keep working on it. I kind of plotted out the hair, the clothes and the skin, and I spent time carefully outlining the eyes and working on the palette and the details in those areas, just hoping that maybe it would work out and come together how I'd hoped in the end. I pushed on until stepping back for a minute, and I stepped back just to look at it and take a breath. And that's when I realised that I was hating what I saw. I didn't like it and it didn't look right. The face was off, but the entire image felt off in a way that I can't exactly explain either. It's like the idea was saying it was wrong. The small theme of a universe and the heart didn't quite come through at all, and it just didn't feel right. It was dull as well, something I feel like I have seen in about 10 other places or drawn myself about another 5, with it just lacking in something. The face wasn't right and the character wasn't, so I kind of knew that I would have to change it for the idea to come together. The line of logic meant I became far less precious about this process and drawing as a whole. It began to wonder something. What if the person wasn't exactly human or didn't need to resemble one? It's always some strange mental block that I often find myself in, where I kind of get stuck almost thinking that people and humans have to be seen in what I'm drawing, or that anything like this has to be a human as we recognise it. Yet one of my favourite things to look at and talk about is looking at the line of a creature to a monster to an animal and human and where we fit into all of that. Yet I can never quite convince myself to draw anything like it. I will draw dreams and nightmares where people are featured, but I never quite draw the ones where it's something less humanoid. This time, I want to say that I dipped my toe into the water. I would keep the hair, as I liked that presence in the drawing, and it was the one part of the figure that I knew I would miss if I had to remove it entirely. The colour may have been open to change, and the texture could have changed to more of a mist. Yet I would keep the hair-like structure. The skin and face were not afforded the same mercy. Not so much. This will kind of be the first detail to discuss here as well, since I will not hesitate to admit this once more. I was making this part up as I went. I considered making something on its face resemble eyes and possibly tying them in somehow, yet it didn't work or look right. I didn't like them, and at this point they didn't need them, and they were getting in the way and taking away from the abyss-like creature that I'd otherwise been coming to work on in this stage, and so they got taken out. It wasn't something I planned, and the eyes weren't something I planned either, I was just winging it. But this let me instead focus on the light and the shadows on the face, at least for a while, as I knew that they didn't really need to make much sense either, especially since there is no one but me deciding how light may react with this creature's skin or the void that makes it up. I went heavily into the space theme at this point and kind of went all out with it. It's partly why I still say it may read as the idea of a universe's heart when all is said and done. Yet at the same time, it also wasn't the important thing anymore. I could have fun with it and look at the rest of the image instead, since I had something that I was happier about for the figure. This, anyway, leads us into the second and third details of this piece, as we are gradually starting to come up to time here. These two were a sort of 2-for-1 deal, in terms of the drawing anyway, as they saw a lot of the same processes and thoughts when going into them, as I originally intended for them to be broken up further by some other details or sections in the image. I think I planned originally for there to be more of a galaxy behind the figure, as if they're surrounded by them, or I maybe thought I'd put more focus on some constellations around the halo or in the background. Though that didn't quite happen, and I naturally came to ignore these, as I kind of began experimenting instead, and since I could kind of tell before adding them that they wouldn't fit the drawing in the end, and I wanted it to then be quite simple in terms of focal points when experimenting. I didn't want to overclutter it for no reason. That leaves us with just the halo and the universe left to actually touch on, and both were fairly similar in terms of processes and the ideas behind them. It was intentional that I did this as well, since, again, they were of a similar source. Besides, given one was a galaxy and the other was meant to be a tie into that, they were going to need building up in a similar point and a similar process, if that was what I really wanted with them in the end. By this I mean that deciding if I was working from the brightest point outwards or the darkest point inwards, and kind of which one would be easier for this drawing and for both of these sections. And by now I think it's fairly obvious which one I ended up picking. When I came to working on these areas, I kind of plotted out the lightest points first, as that would be the centre of everything that I would then have grow and expanding it out from. Going the other way would have only welcomed error in the later stages, as it's a process that hasn't really worked well for me in the past with other projects. And I do usually prefer to work out and expand, rather than having to worry so much about things fitting or having to cram it all into a set space because I've worked inwards instead. My other issue would have been if I made it too big and wasn't able to make it look right due to the direction, so working outward just made more sense. That isn't to say it wasn't without its own fair share of mistakes either. The entire galaxy had kind of been a process of trial and error, and I repeatedly worked to find a process that I liked for it and to find one that would work for this and the halo itself. Because I ended up recording it first, I simply left out the extra footage of starting it only to scrap it halfway through and to start it again half an hour later. It would have ended up quite a bit longer with this video if I had shown all of that. So the galaxy was the first thing. This was literally just sketching in the motion seen in the reference, and then turning big lines into smaller, more detailed scribbles and lines that would generally follow the rest of the motion to convey what it is. There wasn't much debate on it, and instead more of a process of trying to find something and see if it worked. For example, I liked it a lot, and then I thought the background could afford to be a little bit darker around it all, which meant that I came to introduce the black into everything. This in of itself is a rare thing I do, since whilst I like working with dark colours, adding black to anything is a thing that I do try to avoid without good reason. It's usually hard to shade, too dark, and normally a little bit flat compared to the rest of the image. This time though it wasn't the case, and I could work with it quite happily. It instead enabled me to build contrast between the lighter centre and the darker background. I could then use this to add in more highlights around the lines and add kind of spanning sections, just to build that contrast with the black. And it would let me use the highlights without it looking too out of place. In this way, it all kind of came together from there as well. Back and forth between all of this was a major part of the process, going back to the dark and adding in more light and balancing all out that way. But it did work to come together really, really well. The one change that I made to it all was that I ended up making the galaxy larger on the page, and I kind of gave it that presence that I felt that it deserved for this piece as it was the main focus. Beforehand it had ended up just that little bit too small. It was the point that mattered, so I felt that it should be seen, and it should be treated as such. Now, in terms of the halo, the process was the same but with less steps. They weren't meant to be entirely unique galaxies or something that I was trying to draw attention to. I was trying instead to keep it vague and imply that it is space-related in some sense. Doing too much would have created a conflict in the visuals more than anything, and this is especially true in the later stages where the figure is made of space itself, and it's tied in a bit more that way. It was something I just had to kind of avoid, and keeping them simple did this, without much fuss or fancy tricks that I would need to rely on. I think an initial inspiration had been stars, but the lines were added to then tie them all together in a way that completed the detail. I just didn't want to add too much to it, as I've already touched on. They didn't need the dark blues and the lighter blues around them, and they didn't need a shadow, as it would have pulled away from the figure even more, or it would have risked it clashing with the main galaxy itself. It's why I kept this area very light and very simple, as it is more reliant on the scribbles and other little details here and there to convey it as something altogether. In the end, I also made it fainter and less present. I took parts off the bottom sections that were too close to the main galaxy, as I felt that I had to refine it that little bit, and they were clashing a little bit too much. It took away slightly from the person and the galaxy in that way, so it kinda had to be fixed. I really just wanted the centre of the galaxy to be the brightest section as well. It was the point that mattered the most, and the bright halo came to interfere in regards to that. So it did change. However, with all of that said, I did enjoy this as an experiment and as a process. I could have fun with it, and I wasn't being too precious over what I added or removed. And I will say that I let myself go a little further than I otherwise would have when it comes to my usual work. The details all came together, and I am really happy with how it turned out. But that is also all the time that I have for today. I hope you've enjoyed it, no matter how slightly unusual this piece may have ended up, and be sure to let me know what you think. For now though, have a wonderful day, and I will hope to see you all next time. Goodbye!